Hey everyone, you're here with Mark Batwell at perfectgardens.com. So today we got two questions kind of similar from In Petroco and from Steve Exoff. So first off, In Pet, I'm just going to say it In Pet, I apologize, I can't say the rest. He continues to keep getting botrytis in his clones. He is using RO water, a UV sterilizer, but he is seeing algae and on the third day and botrytis in the plugs. He does acknowledge that there is a temperature issue and that there's a lot of humidity in the domes. So over here with Steve Exoff, we've been talking a little bit back and forth. He wants to know a specific time, a time like time on and time off for the timer. And both of these correlate together. So I'm just going to talk freely and hopefully, Steve, I answer the question a little bit better. So just to be very specific, right off the bat, 15 minutes on, 15 minutes off is the normal cycle for aeroponic cloner.
Are you tired of getting crappy advice from your local hydroponics store? Or having to search all over forums to get advice that only takes you in different directions than solving your immediate problem? Well, join our membership for $50 a month. You get direct access to me. We'll connect on WhatsApp app. And just like this gentleman that started back in July with us, as problems arise, we are here for you.
Okay, so where I'm going to start to bring these two together is now on the temperature. So now we know that that's the cycle, 15 minutes on, 15 minutes off. The reason why you don't want it to be off too long is because obviously there's always going to be humidity in the environment where the stems are hanging, although you don't want it to dry off a little bit, and just having that cycle where it's in constant humidity is going to be better for those roots. But if you were having a temperature issue caused by the pump, you can have a cycle of 15 minutes on, 30 minutes off. If you go farther past that, I'm pretty sure those stems are going to start to not have enough humidity, and you'll probably even start to see some level of drooping at some point. What I would do, and what I do personally whenever I'm dealing with cloners, because they are finicky, you really have to know your growing environment. So we're talking about the temperature on the outside. And what you have to think about your ambient air. If you don't have insulation all over your walls and you are literally next to a wall that maybe you're growing in a shed or something along those lines, your ambient temperature on the outside, like outside the shed or outside the growing environment, and then you have the ambient temperature inside your growing room. And then if you're growing in a tent, something like that, then you have the temperature in your tent, right? So you have three separate environments in this situation you kind of have to be aware of and how they're all going to correlate and affect each other. So what I do when I'm dealing with a cloner is even before I'm even putting clones in my growing environment, I get my cloner for the first week, I figure out my growing environment, I put the amount of water in there, and then I plug in the pump. And I just don't do that. I also will run the light too. I'm going to create an artificial grow environment for 3 days, 7 days, whatever that looks like, to measure the temperature of the water when the lights are on for 18 hours on, and measure the temperature of the water when the lights are off for 6 hours. And obviously do your best. It's more important when the lights are on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my cycle for my pump, 15 minutes on, 15 minutes off. I'm going to have a temperature gauge in the water. A lot of these types of timers now have a cord that you can plug into, and it has a waterproof cord, less than $30, less than $45. A lot of these timers you can get over at the hydroponic stores have these little plugs. You can just put it right into the water reservoir, and it starts to record the temperature of the water consistently. Then on the hour, every hour, you come back into your grow room and you write down the temperature of your water, okay? So let's say the lights turn on at 12 o'clock p.m. So you're going to measure the water right there because that's your base. Then you're going to measure the water again at 1 o'clock p.m. and then 12 o'clock and then 2 o'clock p.m., 3 o'clock p.m., 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way through your 18-hour cycle. Do your best. You might miss some hours. If you do, no big deal. You just want to measure how fast that water is heating up gradually throughout the entire day over the course of the 18 hours. And remember, you're dealing with clones. So I actually recommend having those lights on for 24 hours straight. And in one of the previous videos, I talk about why that's important, and specifically is because plants store their sugars in the root system. And when you have a clone, there's no root system. And so when you turn the lights off, you're telling the plant to start to process the sugars in the roots. And because you have no roots yet, I encourage a 24-hour light cycle because it's constantly signaling to the plant to produce roots so it can store its sugars. So let's go back to the temperature. You measure that temperature on the hour every hour because you want to see this gradual incline. Over the course of the 24 hours, you have to think about water and oxygen carrying capability and also pathogen rate of growth. Okay, so we're dealing with two things. We're dealing with a pathogen rate of growth, and we're dealing with oxygen carrying capabilities of the water. And so if you have the water too warm, it significantly reduces the amount of oxygen that the water can carry. When it reduces the oxygen, it starts to allow the water to slightly become stagnated. I know I'm using the word stagnated just like still water, but I'm more using it as a reference as under oxygenated water. When that happens, it begins to create the perfect environment for bacteria and pathogens to take hold. You can't really get rid of bacteria and pathogens. I know we live in this society of extra clean and antibiotics and sterilization, especially with this whole pandemic thing going on. Everyone's really concerned about the germ situation. But just realize you can't get rid of them. And how you control them, and we're kind of going to go back over here to the botrytis one, how you control them is through, you can use some hydrogen peroxide and he was asking right here, how much mLs per liter. And so anyone knows there is, I believe, 3.785 liters in a gallon. And so what you have to realize with peroxide, the second you put it in there, it begins to oxidize. So right when you put it in there, literally it's going to do its function in the first few minutes, and then it turns back into water because it's losing that extra oxygen, because I believe you're dealing with H3O. I believe that's what hydrogen peroxide is. So when you put it in there, it's immediately oxidizing and it turns into water. So if you put it in a cap full, and I believe regular off-the-shelf peroxide is 3%, in the industry, it sells 30% hydrogen peroxide. And I believe in the back of those bottles, they recommend 1 to 2 capfuls. So don't be afraid to put in 1 capful. Don't be afraid to put in 3 capfuls. At the end of the day, everyone's dealing with slightly different growing environments, slightly different rate of growth. And once again, this peroxide is going to turn into water fairly quickly. So don't be surprised if you're going to be adding in peroxide on a daily basis to help control the bacterial growth, because that's what these products really do. Peroxide, it helps control the speed of the bacterial growth. The drops of balance works differently because drops of balance adds ionic sulfated minerals in the water. When you add more additional trace minerals into the water, it creates more structure within the water, and with more structure, there's more surface area, and with more surface area, more oxygen bonds can be created, so you have a higher oxygen carrying capability because there's more atoms and structure in the water capable of holding on to things. Peroxide's different because it's an H3O product and it oxidizes. So right when it goes in, it oxidizes, and you're fusing in with extra oxygen, which is going to oxidize. But right when the hydrogen goes away, what's interesting, it actually creates the law of void. It enacts the law of void. And the law of void states that if it can be filled, it will be filled, and it normally will get filled with negative before it gets filled with positive. So you have to take that into consideration. Is peroxide the best thing to be using? And if that's all you have, yes, it is, but you're going to want to stay on top of it daily. You're not going to want to put it in once and then forget about adding it in the rest of the time, because when it enacts the law of void, you put it in, it kills everything in your reservoir, but within hours, because you have a higher temperature and because you're dealing with living organic matter, which is the stems, when things die or they're not growing in the right environment, they themselves would begin to break down and produce the things that creates poor environmental conditions or excess in bacterial growth. Okay, so let's go back over here to the water temperature a little bit more. So the reason why you want to measure it on the hour every hour, and then just don't do it for one day. You have to do this literally at the start of every season. You have to do this probably 4 times a year, roughly, or maybe even measure the water once a month. Why is that, right? It's because unless you have completely insulated growing room and your ambient air temperature does not affect the inside ambient air temperature at all, and there is zero correlation. And that happens too, because you can put good money into these rooms, which you have complete control HVAC growing system. The reason why you want to measure it throughout the season is because the ambient air temperature is going to be fluctuating the temperature of that water throughout each and every season. And it's going to be interesting, right? A lot of people don't connect the dots. Like they're like, man, my clones look great in the winter. And then summer comes along like, man, I can't get clones off my cloner. This sucks. I'm going to go back to plugs. And it's really interesting, right? Because they get a great production one time of the season, but then they give up on it later in the season. Why is that? It's because they're not taking into consideration the external temperatures that are changing throughout each and every season and how they are correlated to your indoor grow room. And what's interesting, when they don't make these connections, all they do is give up on one thing, when all of us just really need to do is that we're dealing with a growing season, right? This is the year-round growing season. And sometimes something works and is going to be great for us at one time of the season, and sometimes it's not going to work because we haven't invested the money into these indoor grow rooms properly. So remember this word, guys and ladies, metrics. If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. Let's say it together, guys. If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. That's why you need to know your numbers in your grow room. Your environmental numbers, temperature, humidity. You need to know what's the temperature every day on ambient air. You have to know your numbers in your accounting. If you're distributing your product, it doesn't matter. Your metrics is the foundation for your success. I hope this video was helpful. I apologize I didn't answer the question more thoroughly in these videos. Sometimes my autism kind of gets away with me and I just go off on a tangent. Thank you so much and have a great grow, everyone.